even wired up? Almost. Good afternoon. This is the third in a series of community-wide discussions that we've planned in response to the tragic events of last Tuesday. We've billed this one as a week later. Where are we? Some people might say, well, why have we gone on with business as usual? In some ways we have, in other ways we haven't. I mean, one of the ideas of these forums is so that we as a community can come together and discuss these tragic events. But the other point, I think, was nicely summarized by a message that Professor Applebaum sent to his class. I might read from the beginning of it. It says, "Terror seeks to terrorize, and one of the few responses within our power is to resist terror's intended effect on us and try to regain control of our lives, our purposes, and our projects." In that sense, going ahead with business as usual, the sense of having classes, but altering it so that we have not only these community-wide discussions, but a number of other events which have been sponsored by the various centers around the school, and in a number of classes discussions of this, it seems to be the most appropriate way in which we could defeat the purpose of the terrorists. And if we can turn events like this in our classes into ways to better understand how to cope and prevent such events in the future, then I think business as usual, in quotes, will have been well worth it. I should also say that that if I look at what I've learned in a week, there's several things that stand out. One is the nature of the Kennedy School community. I've been enormously heartened by the responsiveness and concern that's been shared in this community. I've also been struck by the degree of support that we've received from the outside world. I've had scores of emails and other messages from all around the world with condolences, with support. Indeed, it really is quite touching. A third thing that I think I've learned is how much social capital there is in this country. We've been regaled in recent years with theories about the decline of social capital in the United States, and there are some real concerns there. But if you look at the way people have responded in terms of helping each other, of expressing solidarity in the aftermath of these events, there really is a huge fund of social capital to draw upon. And our job is to continue to invest in that social capital so that it'll be there in the future. Yet another lesson that I've learned is the importance and role of public service. And I mentioned that in two ways. One thing that's interesting is there's been a great trend toward privatization, to contracting out of government services. But if you look at the air traffic security systems, which were privatized, you find that the incentives of firms in terms of the hourly wages they were paying to the people who were checking the bags and so on were strongly affected by the need to make a profit. And it may be that there's some functions, some security functions in particular, which really do need to remain in the public sector. I think that's part of a lesson, but there's another lesson about public service that I've learned, which is how deep it goes, and that public service isn't just the president or the cabinet or the people at the top. Public service is probably best epitomized by those New York firemen and policemen who were going up the World Trade Center towers while other people were going down. That is the ultimate in public service. The Kennedy School over the years has about a dozen alumni from recent mid-career years who are in the New York City Police Service. I'm pleased to say that all of them survived. But I am also enormously impressed by the performance of their colleagues who gave their lives. And we intend to name one of our public service fellowships next year in honor of the New York City firemen and policemen who lost their lives. The other thing I've learned, and I will stop with this one and then turn to my colleagues, is how difficult it is to make major changes. Yesterday, I dug out of my files an article that Jim Woolsey and I had written in the Los Angeles Times in 1997, which said that combating terrorism should be the absolute top priority of our national security policy, but that we feared that we would not do anything about it until after we suffered at domestic Pearl Harbor. I'm sad to say that those words turned out to be right. But that does lead to questions of where do we go from here? I can understand why President Bush is using the rhetoric of war to mobilize support, and that is an important dimension. The dangers if the rhetoric of war leads us to frame the issue of combating and suppressing terrorism as a military problem. Military is only part of the solution. A good deal of what needs to be done is hard slogging in civilian trenches. It's work of repairing the seams between the different federal agencies, of basically stitching the seams between the federal government and state and local government, as we've been trying to help with in the executive session that's been carried out here at the Kennedy School over the last year. And it's not something which you solve simply by creating a czar to win a war on drugs or a war on terrorism. Something that's going to require much more careful thought of developing a systemic approach, looking from the early stages of prevention to the last stages of response, and gaming at each level what the terrorists will think of next that they haven't thought of this time. The least likely thing is that they'll do exactly what they did last time. That type of preparation of getting outside of the normal business as usual of the governmental agencies, I think is going to be one of the key things that we're going to need to do as we move forward. And we have to be sure that the rhetoric we use to frame this of, in quotes, a war on terrorism doesn't divert us from the work we're going to have to do of reorganizing ourselves domestically to be able to cope with this. So those are my thoughts about what I've learned in the past week and what I think we'll learn as we move forward. Let me turn to David Pryor, the director of the Institute of Politics, who has an interesting perspective on this.
Dina, thank you. First, Dina, I want to thank you in behalf of all of us for doing this continuing dialogue with students, faculty, staff, Harvard community, Kennedy School of Government. All of us together, we are very grateful to you for your leadership. I think it has really served us well. I doubt there is another institution in the world that is doing this continuing dialogue like we are here, and I applaud your leadership, and we really thank you very much. Momentarily, I'm going to stand. Oh, I thought I was going to stand. Maybe I'm not. I'm going to stand just a moment because I want to show you a. Is this on?
Yes.
I'm glued. Well, I think I'll just sit down then. I was going to show you this newspaper here. I'm a politician, and all my life I've been called upon to get up and kind of say the right thing in all of these circumstances that you might not can imagine all the time that you know what you're going to say. This is one of those times when truly I don't know what to say. And I'm sort of caught hoping I will not engage in some sort of empty platitude or platitudes. And I'm hoping just to sort of be here as a reminder of this past week of what we might remember about it. I got a copy of the New York Times, Dina and my colleagues, of Tuesday, the 11th of September. And here's the New York Times. The main story is about a fashion show in New York City that is just opening. Here's stem cell research. Here's about the budget, the surplus. Over here is about the lockbox. Remember the lockbox of a week ago? On into the papers, a story about Chandra Levy, where is she? And then Gary Condit. Gary Condit, remember him? Everything seems so irrelevant now. So I decided then I would start looking at the last week's papers of the last 7 days to see about maybe new stories and new words that have been seared in our memory forever. The World Trade Center, Taliban, terrorists, Ground Zero, Wall Street, courage, firefighters, Pentagon, vigils, prayer, survivors, CNN, fear, caring, pain, cowards, tears, bravery, sacrifice, freedom, togetherness, blood, funerals, bin Laden, retaliate, flags, war, NATO, cells, brotherhood, touching, grief, debris, security, defense, civilians, Pearl Harbor, get ready, Arabs, Israel, harboring, hope, wanted, dead or alive. These are stupendous times. These are times that do try men's souls. These are times when we may not be able to figure out exactly about this new enemy, to know who they are or where they are, when they will strike again, as Joe Nye has said. But there's one thing for certain that is encouraging, that gives us hope and gives us courage and maybe gives us comfort. We're finding out about ourselves. We're being put to a test. And as a people, and as a country, as a nation, we're finding out a lot about ourselves and our souls and what we've got to do in the coming days and perhaps years ahead. And that's about leadership. That's about this school. It's about the Kennedy School of Government. It's about who will lead and how you will lead. It's about you as the future leaders that will be making momentous decisions that will affect all of civilization. And truly, it's going to be about America. I don't know if you saw Letterman last night and Dan rather breaking down, but it was a very emotional moment because it's about us, what we've got to do, as I've said before, and about what really counts and what really matters. And I just wanted to sort of bring those points out, Dean. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Let me turn next to Kim Campbell, who is a lecturer in the school and, of course, former Prime Minister of Canada, among very many other distinctions. Kim?
Well, thank you very much, Joe. It's been a very interesting week for me. Last week, I got a call from the Prime Minister's office inviting me to a memorial service in Ottawa that was held on Friday. And the young woman who left the message sounded vaguely embarrassed. She said, "I realize you're in Boston and you won't be able to come, but the Prime Minister wanted to make sure you were invited because, of course, I'm someone who, like many of us here, takes planes like buses, and no one was getting on the bus at Logan last week. But it was interesting because last Friday in Ottawa, 100,000 people came out to Parliament Hill to express their solidarity with the United States, and there are blood drives all across the country. And I think one of the things we've learned is that the United States has a lot of friends, and that many of America's closest allies are very ready to work collaboratively in the fight against terrorism. And that for many of America's allies, there's a hope that this will be a new era of multilateral cooperation, because the battle of terrorism can't be won alone. And there have been some disquieting signs with the new Bush administration that America wanted to go alone on a lot of things that it cannot go alone on. The other thing I think we've learned is that we know that the politics in the Arab world and the Muslim world are very delicate, and that there are a lot of ways in which actions the United States can take can make things worse rather than better. But what we have seen is the differentiation among those regimes. Tom Friedman of the New York Times happens to be in the Middle East, and he's written some really excellent columns since last Tuesday. And today he writes about being in Jordan in a discussion he had with King Abdullah, who has some very wise advice to give about how the United States should deal with the Islamic regimes, with the Arab regimes of the Middle East and elsewhere. And in fact, tonight on Larry King Live, I think King Abdullah and his wife will be there. And so we have a tendency often to look in kind of broad brushstrokes at these countries. The situation is delicate. It is important for the United States to understand that in its relationships with Pakistan, for example, that you can destabilize a whole relationship in a whole area when you put certain kinds of demands on. And yet, interestingly enough, we have seen countries finding ways and finding formulas to enable them, at least rhetorically, to be helpful. But in many of those countries, even that rhetoric is extremely, extremely dicey, extremely dangerous for them. So I think that has been interesting to see that there is a broad recognition among governing powers of the risk that this kind of activity creates. We know the names of the hijackers, but we still don't know if there was any single mind, clear command. We've seen the link to Osama bin Laden. I hope that there will be a continuing effort to be very clear on what those relationships are, because, as King Abdullah said, it's important for the United States to deal with this issue on the basis of what makes America strong and different. In other words, to avoid rushing to judgment on things, to make sure that everything that is done is a beacon, is part of this really extraordinary set of values, which is what America stands for. We've seen the reality of what a terrorist attack can really mean, not just in terms of the terrible destruction and the loss of life, which is mind-boggling and something which Americans have not experienced on their own territory. Even, I mean, it's outweighs Pearl Harbor even in terms of lives lost. But in terms of the interrelatedness of aspects of the economy, when we're looking at the question of whether the airlines are going to be able to survive, and yet these are such an important part of the lifeblood of this country, we're beginning to see the tiles in the mosaic of what goes into making a developed, complex society function, and just how vulnerable we are, and how things that we take as being second nature as part of our lives can be threatened. And I think that's really important for us to understand. We've also seen that this scenario, in fact, had been thought of. As Dean Nye says, there are people who've been warning about these possibilities, and we know that the warnings were not acted on. We know that the closest planes that could scramble in Washington, D.C. were too far away to be helpful. Why weren't there planes to scramble at Andrews Air Force Base or even at National Airport? The need to coordinate, the need for people to think the unthinkable and plan on that basis is something that's become very clear over this week. We've seen, as Dean Nye said, that smaller government has security implications. It's interesting. I come from a country that is much more comfortable with the notion that there is a role for government. There are certain values that Canadians are not prepared to leave to the market because we don't think the market can work to protect everyone. Healthcare system is one. And I think what we're seeing is that there are certain functions that are so fundamental to our well-being that we need to create them communally, and rather than seeing government as some kind of alien entity, which is much more the American view, I mean, Canadians see government as a tool to serve the interests of society. They see it as the vehicle through which we act as a community to do the things that we can't do either individually or we can't leave to the private sector. And I do think this is an opportunity to rethink the role of government. Governments do matter. There are so many ways in which governments work to assure our security, and when we don't recognize that and support them, we risk serious loss. There is a role for government. The war terminology, as Dean Nye said, concerns me because it isn't clear that there's a state. Wars are things that we engage in against states. The battle against terrorism is a battle in many ways. It's a law enforcement battle. But also, it's a struggle that can't be won, as I said, unilaterally. Two final things I want to say. First of all, it is very popular among certain kinds of ideological persuasions or at certain periods of history to talk about the decadence of great wealthy powers, you know, decline and fall. I mean, is the United States going to be like the Roman Empire, et cetera? Well, we know the Roman Empire probably fell because it had lead pipes, not because it was particularly decadent. I think one of the things that we have seen this week is that the United States and the other highly developed industrial economies are not, the United States is not flabby. There may be mistakes that have been made in policymakers. Democracy is a blunt instrument. It's not a precision tool. And every once in a while, we get a wake-up call that helps us to focus in much more directly on what we need to do with our democratic powers. But the United States is not a decadent society. There are enormous reserves of moral strength, and that moral strength comes from liberty. And anybody who tries to say that that very liberty and that very expression of diversity was somehow, you know, the mechanism that brought God's wrath down on people, I think is singing from the wrong songbook. I think what we have seen is that free societies are very powerful and strong societies because they liberate the creative and moral force of individuals. And finally, and I think it's very important, particularly in this kind of a setting, we know that we're moving into knowledge-based economies. We're very concerned about the quality of education. We're very concerned about high tech. And this is a week where we have seen really the extraordinary importance of the blue-collar sector of society. The service industries, not just the policemen and the firemen, the steel workers. We heard some rescue workers talking on television about they'd never worked with steel workers before. These people have huge skills and courage, whose abilities were absolutely essential to being able to perform the humanitarian task. And we need to look at the balance, the distribution of wealth, how we see our future, to make sure that people in all of those essential services to society are adequately rewarded, properly trained, protected, and treasured by their society. So I think it's an opportunity to do a lot of rethinking about our society.
Thank you, Kim. Ash Carter is a professor at the school and was my colleague as Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon. Ash?
Well, I think that for me, as someone who has been saying for a number of years, and Joe has as well, been worried about this and trying to get the national security community more involved in counterterrorism. And I think for any of you who are already, and I know we have a number of students who are already in the national security community, whether uniformed or not, I think the sensation we have to feel is one of failure. This is the test by which by which the public is entitled to judge the expenditure of $330 billion a year, and it's failure. And that makes me very sad, and it's a very personal and professional kind of sadness. At the same time, I'm an optimist about our ability to prevail against terrorism. There's so much that we can do to combat this problem that there's no doubt in my mind that we will prevail, and that we'll prevail in such a way as we protect everything that my predecessors have spoken about so eloquently that we value in society. I'm a practical person, and a week is gone now, and for me it's time to pick ourselves up and move on here and ask ourselves how we're going to carry this out. Now, my three predecessors spoke of Pearl Harbor as the historical reference. For them, that's fine. I would suggest a different. I don't like Pearl Harbor because it leads to war and it leads to a simple picture what we're up. Let me suggest a different historical reference for you, which is the explosion in 1949 by Joseph Stalin of an A-bomb, which similarly, although no destruction was done at that time on U.S. territory, riveted everyone's attention. It became immediately apparent that huge warlike destruction could be visited upon this place in a very short period of time with very little warning, in a manner, in a struggle, in a twilight struggle that nobody understood fully at that time. And that scared and motivated and galvanized excuse me, this nation and its friends around the world to embark on what ended up being a 50-year campaign that we got through. It wasn't a one-trick thing. We didn't just build nuclear forces because they had nuclear forces, though we did that. We built defensive forces, active and passive defenses. We changed our diplomacy. We changed our way of thinking. Importantly, and this is a point I think Joe was alluding to earlier, we realized in 1949 that we didn't really fully understand the problem we were facing, and that one of the responsibilities we had was to think about it more systematically and carefully. Institutions like the Rand Corporation were established in California, and over that 50 years, thoughts were had, ideas were had that were not obvious in 1949. Arms control was one of them that helped us get through it safely. And so that's my reference point today. Now, of course, there was a dark side to the aftermath of 1949 as well. Reds under the bed and witch hunting and blacklists and so forth. Also a lesson for today. What would a strategy look like that was like the one that was slowly and laboriously and creatively put together over 50 years to get us through the Cold War without blowing ourselves to smither? What would that look like today? Well, Joe said this earlier, and I want to echo it. There's so much talk about retaliation. Retaliation is important. I'll come back to say a little bit later. Might even be effective under certain circumstances, but it's just one arrow in the quiver. And this single-minded attention to retaliation, I think, is carrying us away from thinking about the whole program that we need. And as we pick ourselves and move on, let's pause for a moment on what that program is. That's you have to look at an incident, what precedes an incident, the incident itself, and the aftermath, and ask yourself in each of those stages, what do I need to do? Detection, intelligence. By the way, not just detection of people who might do things, but detection and grasping of the tactics they might use. Everyone said, well, we didn't identify these 12 people. That doesn't shock me. What shocks me is that we did not, I don't know how many of you felt that you had fully internalized the ease with which the tactic they used could circumvent 25 years of airline safety innovation. That's shocking, that's inexcusable. Not rounding up 12 people doesn't fall in that category to me. So there's detection, and there's a lot we can do there that is not compromising civil liberties. It's applying common sense to dangers that we face. Then there's prevention. A lot could be said about that in changing our world and changing the perceptions that people have that lead them to this kind of violence, and in denying them the means, whether it be germs or nuclear materials, that permit them to do this. So prevention is a whole category of things we need to look at. Protection. Is the air in this building filtered? Are you vaccinated to anthrax? Those aren't cosmic things. They're ways you harden a target. You make it tougher. You raise the bar for someone who would harm you. We do that all in our everyday life, and we will learn to do it against this problem as well. There's the stage at which the incident occurs, and we need to be able to respond to minimize loss of life, whether that be in the way it was done in New York with field hospitals set up in a very short period of time. We need to be ready to do that as well. And yes, then also finally retaliation as well. But there's a whole spectrum of things. And if we think about it hard and we get good at it, I have no doubt that we can. This is an inventive country. It's a very, it's got huge resources. It, I think, has basically the support of most of human kind, and we will prevail. Let me close on one note, which is why wasn't it done? Why is it so hard? And there is a big but to everything I said about that if we can do it. And that is the following. Joe alluded to this as well. If you ask what category does this fit in, or said differently, whose responsibility was it to make sure this didn't happen? Well, let's think about that. Was it a crime? Well, it's a crime, but it's an awfully big crime for the word crime. Was it a war or an attack? Well, it's not exactly right either. If it's a crime, of course, then it's the law enforcement community's responsibility. If it's a war, then it's the national security communities. Is it a disaster? Well, then it's the Federal Emergency Management Agency and all that sort of. Well, this is a problem that is all of the above and none of the above. And said differently, it falls in the cracks in our categories of thinking, and that's reflected in our government. It falls in the cracks between the institutions we have charged to solve different kinds of problems for us. That means this problem isn't going to be solved until we can create a managerial principle that goes with something that is not a war and bigger than a crime. And you can't wait for we wait for crimes to occur and then you get the person who did it. You can't have these kind of crimes. So the whole crime model doesn't work. The war model doesn't work either. We're looking for a third way to manage this effort. That, I think, is the tricky question of policy design. And you all are the future. You're the ones who are going to live with this problem, and I certainly hope do better than has been done so far. You've got to create and execute that program. And I think it's time to, the morning has taken place for a week now, and that will continue forever. Time to pick ourselves up and figure out how we're going to get through this.
Thank you. There are 2 mics here on the floor. There are 2 mics in the halfway up to the balcony on each side. And unlike a forum event where you're supposed to only ask a question, since this is a community discussion, short statements are also permitted. But remember, short is important so that we can share the time with each other. And I'd like people, as they come to a mic, to make a comment or ask a question, to identify themselves and their relation to the Kennedy School. Yes?
I'm Sonia Smith, an intern at the Centre for International Development. And Tuesday was a great tragedy. Any loss of life is a tragedy. But I guess what I'm wondering is, why is it that the military retaliation is an option that's being considered at all? Why isn't a purely judicial option being thought of as the response? And that's both by ordinary people and by policymakers. Because if one person is killed, it leads to a criminal investigation. 300 people are killed, as they were in Oklahoma, then it's also a criminal investigation. If a huge number is killed, it's a crime against humanity. That's what the International Criminal Court is for. So I guess I'm wondering why this country that encourages everyone to apply the rule of law throughout their dealings doesn't apply it in this case and use due process and innocence before guilty and sufficient evidence, and why that's not enough. And I thought about it and I could think of 3 reasons, and maybe you've got better ones and that's what I'd like to hear. One of them was revenge. And for me, revenge is not a justifiable or a responsible basis for making public policy, especially when it's public policy that affects the rest of the world, and especially when it could lead to other governments also using it to justify their retaliations. The second one was prevention or deterrence, and I guess I feel that military retaliation for terrorism in the past hasn't been so successful at that. You could argue, or it may seem, that what happened in Sudan actually inflamed or increased anti-American feeling. And the third one is people perhaps criticise the judicial process as taking too long, that it just takes too long to accumulate all the evidence. But isn't it important to get the verdict right? And if that takes a long time, then it takes a long time, because correctness in making sure you get the right person, especially with all the implications for international relations, peace on this earth, is important, much more important than speed. And I would dispute whether the judicial process actually takes as long as people think. So I guess I've thought long and hard about this, and I'm wondering, what is the justification that I'm missing that makes this military option so necessary? And I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Ash, do you want to try that first?
It's a deep question and a good question, and I admire your reasoning. And I sympathize with it a lot. I think I come out at a different place, though, in respect of the particular matter of bin Laden, if that is the question, and the cells which surround him. The question, of course, our preference would be to conduct what's called a rendition, where you grab a terrorist, and under our law this is legal, and bring them to the United States and put them on trial. And it's conceivable, but only remotely conceivable to me, that that's feasible in this case. This is an individual who, by his own admission and multiple tapes and so forth, has professed an aspiration to do this kind of damage to people. And to me, in that circumstance, that is sufficient justification to take, I won't call it military, but to take dead or alive action against someone who is associated with an event like this. In war, and again, this is somewhere in between a war and a crime, but the idea that you allow this to occur and then later have a trial of the perpetrator is, I think, something that is not practical in this circumstance. And the burden of proof, it's very tricky, and I don't think it's been defined for us yet, but it lies somewhere between the legal standard which would justify the incarceration of a U.S. citizen and the standard of war, which is a standard of self-defense against those who take actions or profess to be willing to take actions against you. One is the war model, and we accept that in war, including accepting the possibility that there will be those who surround the perpetrators who also get killed simply because of their proximity to the perpetrator. And the legal standard, which is much narrower and much stricter, that's a way in which we need to find a third way that we can live with in our consciences, but that's also practical. And the idea that we're going to bring all these people back and run them through an American court system, that is not a practical aspiration. We need a third way.
Let me just quickly add two footnotes to what Ash said. First of all, to bring bin Laden or anyone to trial, you have to catch him. You have to get hold of him. And for years, we have asked the Afghan Taliban government to hand him over, and they've refused. One of the things you have to put in your syllogism is the threat of force essential to the willingness to hand him over for trial? And the other thing is that in your three reasons, you might want to add a fourth, which is if they are unwilling to hand him over for trial, is there something to be said for the use of force for disruption, which is a fourth category? In other words, to take this person who has access to vast resources, financial and organizational, and try to disrupt this organization. It doesn't mean it'll be the end of terrorism. It also doesn't mean there will be others who will spring up to take its place. But it won't be quite the same organization as it is now. And I think you have to add that fourth to your three categories and also ask for the category that you want or your preferred category, which is trial in the justice system. Is the threat of force an essential condition to be able to implement the trial? In the balcony.
Hello, my name is Mike Rosenberg, and I'm an undergraduate student here at Harvard. And oddly enough, I'm also Canadian, like Miss Campbell. I suppose my question is, in that respect, directed mostly at what Miss Campbell was saying regarding expanded powers for government under the Canadian model. And I was wondering if you would care to elaborate on what you mean by that, and where you would like to see expanded government involvement to ensure that a tragedy like this never happens again.
Well, I think it's just that if the center of gravity of Canadian politics would be seen as very much to the left of the United States. Although we have our own political debates about the scope of government. We've had privatization of crown corporations, and I mean, we have learned that governments are not good at picking economic winners, for example, and as agents in economic development. But I think that what we've seen in the United States, I mean, and there has been a debate about airport security. Several years ago, there was a recommendation from a commission headed by, I think, 2 members of the American Congress or 2 members of the American Senate that argued that this service ought to be nationalized. One of the leading airline executives argued that at least, for example, a single corporation should be formed in order to perform this task. And I think that sometimes you can take an idea like free enterprise and find there are areas which it doesn't work, because when you're dealing solely with the private sector, the concern is the bottom line. Costs are high. Airlines, who are bearing the responsibility for these costs, are suffering considerably financially. I mean, these are industries where their profit margins are not all that high. We know they're going to suffer terribly from these events. And so it is not it's not creeping socialism, as many Americans seem to fear, to say that there are certain services that ought to be performed by the public sector. And I think in Canada, as in Europe, as many of the European countries, there is less of an ideological resistance to that. I think this circumstance will change Americans' views that they will understand. Just as, I mean, the notion of private police forces and private fire departments, I mean, these are services that must be created, and even in small communities that don't have the resources to fund these things on their own. There are vehicles that other levels of government have to make sure that people have policing, that they have fire protection, because you can't survive as a community without that. So I think this is something that is going to be one of the clear outcomes of this event will be a total rethinking and restructuring of that service.
Let's go to the other balcony.
Hi, I'm Navlin. I'm with the undergrad college. And my question, I guess, addresses more of the fundamental ways that we can prevent such events, not really in enforcement or detection, but in the ways that we deal with the other people of the world. There have been a lot of discussions about how this attack wasn't just an attack on human lives of United States citizens, but also a symbolic attack on what American values, which include things like freedom and trade, things that the World Trade Center seemed to symbolize. And with that, and things in context of things such as Professor Huntington's thesis on the clash of civilizations, I think perhaps it's appropriate to talk about how there are groups and religions and cultures out there, and perhaps small groups of people who have fundamental beliefs that are opposed to what what we believe, things about different ideas about trade and freedom and modernity. And in that context, do you think those are problems that are applicable in this specific case, and what types of things we can do to address those differences in opinion that are so fundamental to the way we live? I know, like, we have Voice of America. Those are some things that we used during the Cold War to communicate with communist nations, but what type of things can we use in this case to address those differences?
David, do you want to say something?
Well, I think the question is very profound, and I do not have a profound answer, but we're in such a totally different environment today than we were 7 days ago that it's hard for us to even comprehend where we are. But yesterday in USA Today, I'm just going to read you a couple of sentences. There was a wonderful op-ed piece. Quote, "Imagine a war in which U.S. forces rely on Russian spies, Pakistani airspace, Iranian political pressure, and support from 6 of the 7 nations which is on our list of terrorist sponsors. Imagine a conflict in which there would be no marching of mass troops against the enemy, no seizing of capital cities, and no huge formations of tanks and warplanes squaring off in dramatic, high-stake battles. We are in, and I think my colleagues will agree, we've never been here before. And we're all sort of stumbling through it together. We're sort of holding on to one another, and we don't quite know which step to take next. But we're taking steps. And I think it shows the maturity of our country. I think it shows the strength of our system. And I think it really shows what we're all about. And I think this in itself will be the greatest lesson that these terrorists and these people who want to basically destroy those symbolic things that have made our country different and better and greater. I think this is the strong message that we can leave, that we're not going to tolerate this. We're going to prevail. We're going to succeed. And we're going to, if I may use, we're going to overcome.
Kim?
Can I just add a little bit, there are 2 causes that I feel very passionate about and that I do international work on. One is the advancement of women, and the other is democratization. And the process of supporting democratization is a very difficult one. One should never underestimate the challenges of it. But it's very interesting to look at many of these countries that harbor terrorists, that have fundamentalist governments. They're not democracies, even if they use some democratic institutions. I think of Iran, for example. It's not a democracy in our sense. We saw a woman who wanted to run for the presidency. She was so harassed that she pulled out. You have a government that is, that expresses a certain view of society. What I was astonished to find out that the most popular television program in Iran is Baywatch. It may be because Pamela Anderson Lee is a Canadian. Who knows? I mean, from my hometown, and that's the only resemblance between the two of us. But I think my frontal lobes are a little higher. But anyway, just kidding. But I think the important point is that there is this very interesting disconnect between certain articulations of values, and I am the last person to argue that there's something to criticize about American culture. In fact, one of my roles as a Canadian diplomat for 4 years was to, argue that other countries need to be able to express their values, and that American culture isn't necessarily universally admired everywhere, or that there aren't things to criticize about it. But when you look at things like that behavior, there is a disconnect between often what is articulated and what people really want. And I have a lot of faith that if people are genuinely empowered and societies become genuinely democratic, and I mean genuinely, and again, it's important to make the distinction between those who use the facade of democratic institutions to legitimize governments where, in fact, they are not genuinely democratic. I think that's another long-term project, but one that we can work to build on. And there are a whole variety of organizations. I'm actually going to be involved next month in a big conference in Madrid on democratic transformation and consolidation, and I'll be teaching a course on it after Christmas. In other words, I think that's a very important foundation for creating the kinds of changes that we really need. And if we look at who the villains are in the piece, or who are the problems are in the piece, first of all, they oppress their women. Secondly, they're not democratic. And those changes, I think, are fundamental to the long-term solution of this problem.
I want to make a sort of analytical point here, which I think is terribly important. I don't want to put words in your mouth, the questioner, but I think we need to be very careful about thinking of this as a war between Islam and the West, number one, or number two, of that somehow we caused this. My understanding and belief of this situation is that we are largely seeing the reflection of a civil war within a certain part of the world, which happens to be Islamic, but this could happen anywhere that had suffered the same kinds of prolonged internal turmoil. Very small fraction of the population has turned to violence. The external world, which we symbolize, together with the softness of the target that we represent, because of so many wonderful things about the society that we inhabit, create this opportunity, but it's really a very small thing. And I have many, many friends throughout the Middle East and in the Islamic world, and many of them disagree violently with all sorts of things about the United States and its attitudes and the way it conducts itself in the world and all kinds of other issues, but they're not on board with this kind of terrorism. And I think we need to be analytical and precise in defining what it is that is objectionable and that we can all agree is objectionable, and where there's a space for disagreement, including a clash of civilizations in the friendliest and most productive way, where we learn from one another around the world. But this isn't a clash of civilizations. This is a splinter of a splinter of a civil war being visited upon all of us. That's my analysis, and I don't think we need to feel responsible for it. Now, having said all that, I also believe, however, that over the long run, a successful campaign against it will necessitate continuing to have, among all those 99% of the population not part of these activities, some reasonable feelings of amity towards the United States, and that will in turn require that we conduct ourselves well. So we didn't cause this, and I don't feel a bit guilty about it, but I realize we can't fix it unless we're also sensitive to that other side of our conduct.
Sometimes people say that terrorism is all relative, that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. I don't think that's right. I think the hardcore of terror in terms of an objective description that Ash referred to, is the killing of innocent people for political effect. And that is condemned by all the world's major religions, including Islam. And the fact that less than 0.1% of Muslims may have done this act is no more representative of Islam than the fact that less than 0.1% of Americans have engaged in hate crime against Muslims in the last few days. So it's very important not to take the events of last week and read them as support for a grandiose theory of clash of civilizations, which is suspect in its own terms. If it were a clash of civilizations, we should ask, why are there more conflicts within Islam than between Islam and the rest? So I do think you don't be very careful as a first year at Harvard not to let big theories overcome facts. Yes. Yeah.
I wanted to try to focus the discussion more specifically on U.S. policy in the Middle East in particular and in Islamic countries, particularly since I guess most of you have been involved in the last decade or so in creating these policies.
Sorry, would you identify yourself?
Oh, yes, sorry. My name is Geneve Abdo. I'm a Neiman Fellow this year. I mean, it's been written about, of course, extensively, the whole issue of foreign policy in the Middle East, but I think that it really hasn't been discussed in any real detail in these types of forums, not only in terms of the Arab-Israeli conflict, but also in terms of the United States policies toward the Muslim world in general, even if you consider, for example, the fact that the United States boycotted and walked out of a conference 2 weeks ago to make a certain type of political statement. So I'm interested in knowing what where you feel that blame lies in terms of U.S. policy, not only vis-a-vis the Arab-Israeli conflict, but in countries such as Iran, Pakistan, and in the entire region.
Go ahead.
Well, again, my reaction to what you've said is a lot of sympathy and understanding for the difficulties of Middle East policy, and also some sympathy for the proposition that the United States hasn't always conducted itself in a way most conducive to causing peace there. I get off your train when you say, whose fault is this event? I don't see it connected. I've followed bin Laden now for 4.5, 5 years now, Joe, long before it became popular. You know, the peace process went up and down. By my lights, American policy was good and bad in different times. And, you know, bin Laden just went cruising right along there the whole time, working these cells, many of which we've broken up, plots, many of which we've broken up over the last 5 years. Not a lot of publicity about that, but a lot of stuff has been prevented. And he doesn't pick up the paper every morning and ask what our policy is and then decide whether he's going to try to take out the World Trade Area. He's working on it every day. So I think we're confusing two categories here. And one is about our Middle East policy. The other is about this particular flavor of terrorism, which is seeking messianic and purely destructive objectives, rather than, let us say, a PLO objective of the early 70s, which is get attention for my cause. Now that I can relate to a little bit, even though it's still terrorism. But just kill a lot of people, that's different. And it's quite disconnected, I think, from the policy thread and the policy debate.
I'm sorry, given the number of people waiting, I'm going to have to ask one question.
Could I just ask you one follow-up question?
No, and I'd be nice to have a debate, but there are at least 20 people lined up, and it wouldn't be fair to the others.
My name is Alyssa Bernstein. I'm a fellow at the Center for Human Rights, the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy here at the Kennedy School. I want to pick up a theme from the first question. The first questioner raised the prospect of a judicial solution in contrast to the use of force. The responses provided reasons as to why it might be justifiable and desirable or wise to use force. I want to distinguish between uses of force, in particular between using force of various kinds against terrorists, specific terrorists and terrorist cells in the effort to destroy their power. And on the other hand, broader uses of force going to war. I think that if it is possible for us to avoid going to war now, there are many reasons why it would be desirable. Furthermore, there are alternative courses of action available to us which might better serve our objectives. And our objective, we should keep in mind, our primary objective is safety and security for ourselves and the rest of the world. It's often been noted that it's not clear what the target would be if we were to go to war. What are we going to attack? There's no state. However, we have issued a kind of an ultimatum to the state of Afghanistan saying hand over bin Laden or else. However, it remains the case that bin Laden is our primary concern. He moves around. He's probably gone up into the mountains. It's not clear what our target is if we're going to launch a military attack of the standard kind. There are reasons why to avoid such an attack, including the obvious fact that it may spin out of control. It could be a very large and protracted war. I heard this morning on the news on WBOR that the Afghanis have declared a jihad against the U.S., and they have declared that the U.S. is launching a war against Islam. We may know that we're not doing that. We need them to know. If we launch a military attack against Afghanistan, it's going to be very hard to persuade the Afghanis that we're not, or anybody else in the Muslim world, that we're not launching a war against Islam. Others have noted that we would be liable to get into a war as protracted and difficult to win as the Vietnam War. There are reasons to avoid getting into war. There are also alternatives available to us. One of our primary objectives right now should be to make clear to the Muslim world that the U.S. is not launching a war against Islam. There are many means of making that clear. More generally, it seems that we should undertake to change our approach to foreign policy. Listen to those who are screaming at us as loudly as they can. Do what we can to rectify some of the world's injustices. However, my specific question right now is, can we avoid getting into war? What might be an alternative response to the Afghanistan government's refusal to hand over Osama bin Laden? It looks likely that they are going to refuse. Are there policy alternatives? And what can the American public do now? What may you recommend, perhaps, to the American public that we do to prevent our government from dragging us into a war that we may very deeply regret in the future?
I think you've made a number of good points, and I think going to war with Afghanistan would be counterproductive. I still think you have to come to terms with the question I asked earlier, which is there may be circumstances in which if you want to put bin Laden on trial, and the Afghan government has refused to put him on trial for years despite our requests, or to hand him over for trial, is the threat of force, not the use of force, is the threat of force sometimes a necessary condition to be able to get the judicial outcome you want. And I think there is a difference between winding up with a Vietnam-like situation in the mountains of Afghanistan and using the threat of force as a way to pry loose something which could lead to a judicial solution. And I think that's something that might be another part of your process. We should go to the balcony.
I'm Alan Spotnitz. I'm in the mid-career program, Master's of Public Administration. I'm a taxpayer in the United States. I'm a cardiac surgeon in New Jersey. I love my country. I never wanted to go to war for my country until I saw the World Trade Center blown up last week. I grew up in New York, and I watched that building go up, and now I've seen it come down. We all are rallying behind President Bush, but I have a question. I've been told that this is something that could not have been foreseen. I've been told I'm supposed to trust my government in Washington, yet Tom Clancy foresaw this 10 years ago. I think millions of people in this country and around the world read that book and saw exactly what could happen, but but nobody really seemed to believe it in Washington. My government didn't seem to believe it, or at least right now they're denying it totally. I had trust in the fact that that I was being protected in an airport by people who run my government. I did not turn over any police authority in any city in this country to a voluntary force or to a private person to take care of it. I want to know, how am I going to trust people in Washington now to make decisions that are appropriate for me? That's what part of our democracy is for, and I don't see it working right now.
David, you have,
Thanks.
as a senator, you've had to
Wow.
face the public with questions like that.
You know, there is a room in the Capitol building, and I think I mentioned this the other day in one of our discussions. Actually, I think it's room 407. It's up in the top of the Capitol. It's a safe room. And this is a room probably where, I don't know where the House goes in a time like this. This is a room where senators go. They walk in there, usually take off their jackets, sit there 2 or 3 hours. They're briefed by the CIA, DOD, FBI, whoever at the moment is their briefing. And in that particular room, I've spent many hours there listening to Persian Gulf briefings. The bombing of the Capitol, I remember in the 1980s, they set a bomb off in the Senate one night, right outside the Senate chamber. I've never heard the word in that room, Democrat or Republican, not once. I have heard the question, let me rephrase, of what is right? What is the right thing to do? And in that particular room right now, or in the last several days, I'm sure that human beings, just like those of us in this room, are struggling to find the right answer. Did we anticipate the blowing up of the World Trade Center? No, we didn't. Did we anticipate the hijacking of those airlines? No, we didn't.
But
Were we prepared for it? No, we weren't. Because it is hard for us as Americans to imagine the depth of that contorted mind conceiving of a thing like this and that degree of evil, and to bring about that tremendous consequence. All I know is this: I think we will be better prepared. Are we going to give up some of our freedoms? Probably. Are we going to have extra precaution? Yes. Are we going to fly as many planes? No. Are we going to have police or servicemen or military on the plane with us? Probably. It's going to change. We were not prepared for this. And if our leaders owe us an apology, I'm sure that no one feels worse than our leaders. But right now we've got to pick up and go forward. We can't just try to play a blame game right now. We can't do it.
The other doctor.
My name is Meredith Pierce, and I work at the Women in Public Policy program. You've each talked about or alluded to the impact of last Tuesday's on the economy, the market economy. And I know that the German equivalent of the SEC noticed right prior to the attack a lot of irregular market activity. And I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on the reports that Osama bin Laden was selling short?
Ash, we heard a report on that last night. You might want to say something about it. Not who, but
yeah. I think that's there's every reason to credit that report. This is an individual and a network that has investments in various places that we've kept track on for a long time, where possible have obtained cooperation in disrupting those finances. But if you're looking for if the fact that he makes tapes which say he aspires to bringing down the World Trade Towers isn't enough for you, and you're looking for further evidence, which, well, you might be, in the days before this event, bin Laden is said to have brought his family out of places where he regarded them as at more risk. as having made some transactions in the stock market, as you indicate, which anticipated Monday's events in the stock market, and taken other actions which at least circumstantially indicate that he knew the dates. I would credit it.
This is probably going to have to be the last question. We were billed to go for an hour. We're already a little over our time. We could go on discussing this for a very long time, but I know a lot of people have buses to catch and schedules to keep, so this will have to be the last question.
Thank you. My name is Peter. I'm a second-year student at the college. I always grew up feeling that there was an asymmetry between the impact of American affairs abroad and the impact of the rest of the world on us, so that any decision made in Washington would have the most profound impact in the most remote street, but no decision made outside of our borders, even, I'm afraid to say, in Canada, would really affect the average American in a way that we would feel. And it seems like this asymmetry, if not being corrected, changed on Tuesday, because some chain of events which had a lot to do with the state of affairs abroad literally plunged our streets into, at least in lower Manhattan, plunged the street into chaos. So are we likely to see now, for the average American, a greater respect for international institutions, a better sensitivity for international affairs, and understanding of the way everything is connected? Or can we expect to go international just long enough for our international war effort and then just pull right back into where the U.S. is what we worry about and the rest of the world is just that?
David, as a man who had to represent the people, how would you answer that?
Peter, I think this event has brought our attention to the fact that we are a pretty small world, and that we as a country cannot isolate ourselves from events, nor can we try to get other countries to isolate themselves from the rest of the world. I think that we are a part of the world community, and we've got to even play a greater role. And oddly enough, there's been a feeling lately that we were trying to separate ourselves from the rest of the world and kind of go it alone. But right now, I think that this has been such a cataclysmic event that it has once again reminded us that we've got to have friends, and we've got to have partners, and we've got to have allies. And I think that we will I think we've learned a great lesson. This is an expensive way to do it, but I think we've learned a real lesson in these last 7 days. Thank you, though.
Let me say in concluding also a comment on your question, which is there is a tremendous danger of America and Americans, because we also are so large and wealthy, of becoming extremely parochial. And indeed, when I greet the new students at the Kennedy School, I point out that we're proud at the Kennedy School that 44% of our students are from overseas. We're the most international school at Harvard, because we regard the students from overseas not only as guests who are picking up an education here, but as teachers who are teaching Americans about what the rest of the world is like. And I advise the Kennedy School students, and I would advise you in Harvard College, where only 6% of the students are non-Canadian foreigners, 9% if you include the Canadians, make an effort to meet somebody from a different country, because that will, and become friends with them, because that will be as important a contribution to your education here at Harvard as any of the courses that you will take. And I think that's something for us to remember as we conclude, which is that we really do have to broaden our perspectives and to think about the world in which we're living. Cliche is that globalization is with us, and the answer is yes, it is. And that means that as we think of solutions, as we try to repair the damage and think of ways to approach the answers in the future, we do want to make sure we think of it from broader perspectives than we've been used to in the last decade or so. In some ways, the end of the Cold War made life too easy for us. The Soviet Union went away, and if you look at what happened according to public opinion polls to American attitudes, we didn't turn isolationist, we turned indifferent to the rest of the world. We spent less time reading and watching foreign events. Our news magazines, our television shows have less content on what's going on in the rest of the world. And I think what David Pryor just said is we can't afford that any longer. So as we go back toward our classes, toward the various events that will preoccupy us in the weeks to come, let's remember that we do have to think about these events in a broader perspective. We hope that these forums or community discussions which we've had will help in that. But I think all of us, as we move forward, want to ask ourselves what we can do and how do we see this in a broader perspective. And again, today, as with the end of our first community discussion last week, I'd urge that we end it with a minute of silence for those who died a week ago today. Thank you all for coming.